Welcome. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
I'm trying to share the screen. Okay, for some reason my computer appears to be slow, but we'll do the best we can. Yeah, it's very slow. And here we are in this great parsha of Yitro, right? A real gem in the Torah, both for the part that we're doing right now and the fact that this is where we read about the giving of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 words, the 10 commandments. That's what we.
Rabbi, sorry
Yes,
I'm late.
yes.
Today is my brother's yard site.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to give
Just
us
let
his name, please?
uh uh Yaakov Mordechai, Joel Levy.
Okay. So we will dedicate this lesson, La'inui Nishmato, for the elevation of his soul, and it also is Janet's mother's yahrzeit, and so we're going to do it in memory of her as well. That we'll dedicate this lesson.
Thank you.
Golda, thank you, thank you.
Where are we starting, Rabbi?
It's going to be chapter 18 of Exodus, verse
Okay.
22, verse 22, and we're just finishing up a section where Moses is visited by his father-in-law, and it's a source of interest and and perhaps an indication of universality that the one of the most important parshiot, if not the most important parsha of the Torah, but certainly one of the most important, that contains the Ten Commandments, is also named after a Midianite priest and Moses' father-in-law. And there's some indication, we've already passed that section, where it uses a word vayichad, which means to rejoice. That is, Jethro rejoiced at the news about how the Israelites were liberated and how God had performed these miracles on their behalf and saved them from the Egyptians. But the word chad can also mean to sharpen. To sharpen something. Lachaded means to sharpen. And the idea of Jethro actually having a brit milah, circumcising himself to enter the covenant of Abraham, and that Jethro actually converted. This Midianite priest became a Jewish person or an Israelite person. I think in some ways it's, first of all, it's anachronistic to speak in those terms. It has more to do, when you talk in those ways, it sounds more like oh gosh, like we're talking about parties, political parties, and we're not. We're talking about belief in God. When we're talking here in the Torah, there's no word Judaism, right? The Israelites are identified as descendants of Jacob, but in other words, Jacob, who was also called Israel, but it has much more to do with values and the belief in one supreme and singular and unique source of everything. That's what it has to do with. It's only later on that things have to become formalized. However, the idea of entering the covenant of Abraham is is also very much a part of this. So there's that sense that we read the last time, or one of the in our previous sessions. So this, I think that's very significant. That this parsha doesn't begin with the Ten Commandments, but begins rather with the whole story of Jethro, and we're finishing that up here. And Jethro gives very important advice to Moses. He sees that Moses is essentially trying to take care of administering justice, and that he's gonna burn out. Jethro sees this. I mean, this is so cool that this early passages, are dealing with very human and very present kinds of things, and he gives him advice regarding the distribution of justice and how to do it, and how to set up a system where you can start so that people can have justice as quick as possible, and then if that needs to be refined, that there's a whole process of courts, just as we do, where you go from a regular court possibly to a district court to ultimately to the Supreme Court. And so Jethro essentially tells Moses to set up that kind of system. And Moses, in fact, does that. And of course, the truth is, without this system, the giving of the Ten Commandments, the giving of any laying down of a system of laws, if it cannot be practically administered, it's of no good whatsoever. And so here we have Jethro, who's setting up a situation where these divine laws can actually be administered. A very powerful message here. That's what we're reading about. And that's why it makes sense to talk about it before the beginning of the Ten Commandments. I think that the, the, the notion of lip service in terms of religion and belief and stated beliefs is definitely out there. It's a much more complicated thing to actually take these things that we could say metaphorically are in heaven, these ideals, and try to ground them and try to put them here in the world, because the truth is, unless they really are part of the world, they're ultimately not going to do much good. It's very important to have the right values. It's very important to be able to feel that one can state these things, but they have to be administered. Has to be part of us. Um, I kind of like the New Testament metaphor of saying that the Word became flesh. Although I realize there it refers to Jesus, but here I believe we're talking about everyone. That the words that we are reading, we need to embody. It's another way of saying it. Right. Okay. V'shaftu et ha'am b'chol eit, and they shall judge the people at all times. V'haya kol hadavar hagadol, and any matter that is weightier, we could say, it actually means is bigger, but we're talking about a more complicated case. That if the case becomes too complicated for the lesser court, yaviu elecha. So he's actually saying here that anything that ultimately cannot be judged by the people that Moses sets up, that are set up to do this, they should bring to him. So he actually is the ultimate, he has to be the ultimate arbiter. On the other hand, remember, he has direct communication with the divine. So it's a way of doing this. And the truth is that ultimately, the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, that was 70 elders or 71, excuse me, would judge ultimately. They were the Supreme Court. V'chol hadavar hakaton, and any minor matter, so we could say a major matter, a minor matter, yishpatuhem, they should judge, they should adjudicate. V'hakel me'elecha, and they should lighten from off of you. V'nasu itcha, and they nasu itcha. That's a good question as to how exactly to translate that, and I'm going to actually look to see how they do translate it. They say share the burden. They should, I'd like to say, and Shira Beth, please correct me if I'm wrong, they should carry it with you. Itcha would be with you, v'nasu itcha, they should carry the burden of judgment, of administering justice with you. That's what he's saying. So, v'shaftu, v'shaftu. He gives the Aramaic translation here, Vaidunun Lashun Sivui. So it says you want to understand this as a imperative. In other words, let them judge the people. This is Jethro still talking to Moses, right? Vidulun Lashon Sivui. It is the language, this is the language of the imperative. And the reason for this, let me explain to you grammatically, is that the verb shafat, this is the verb to judge. Shaftu generally is simply third person plural perfect. And so Rashi's trying to tell us that this is not to be understood in that sense, that this is another, that while it's the same form of the verb, it doesn't mean they have judged, or with the vav, they will judge. It doesn't mean they will judge. It means and let them judge. We should understand it that way. V'hakel me'alecha, they should lighten from you, from off of you. Davar ze lahakel me'alecha. You should understand that the purpose of all of this is to lighten your load, right? V'hakal kamo hakel, he's talking now grammatically, right? And this word hakel, let them lighten, kamo hachbed et libo, harden his heart. V'hakot et Moav lashon hoveh. Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm saying something. Um, I guess he's saying actually that here it is the present tense, that it means, and they will. It's that would be imperfect, but but let them lighten, not in the sense of an imperative, but in a sense of it will be, right? It is. It's a situation that will happen. And while I'm saying it in the imperfect sense, it's talking about an ongoing activity, right? So this Lashon Hoveh means present tense. So again, Rashi's parsing out the words here just to um, just to make sense. And I think the importance of it, of going into this kind of detail is because he's saying Vahakel me'alecha, it could be understood as that Jethro is saying to Moses, and lighten for yourself, that he's telling him what to do. And Rashi is saying, no, that's not the meaning. It doesn't mean that Moses should actively try to be easing up his job. That the Hebrew here is actually saying that that's going to be the result of it. Okay, so I hope that's helpful, even though we're going into something deeply, and I apologize for not doing a great job here in the initial interpretation. Going on, all Jethro's words to Moses. Im et hadavar hazeh taseh, if you in fact do this thing, if taseh, if you do, hadavar, and hazeh means this thing, Vetzivcha Elohim, and God commands you to do it. Vayechalta amud, you will be able to stand, right? You won't crash and burn. V'gam kol ha'am hazeh, and also this people, al makomo yavo b'shalom, they will come to its place in shalom, in peace. So whole, secure, etc. See if we have any Rashis on this. Just back up a moment. No. So let's keep going and see what we have here. I
We have
believe
two Rashis on it.
yes, as I recollect. Let me make this a little bit smaller. Here we go. Vetzivcha Elohim v'yacholta la'amod. So Rashi connects these two clauses. And God commands you, and you will be able to stand, right? Literally. And here's how Rashi interprets that. Hamelech bigvura, that is to say, the all-powerful king, right? In other words, and I think what Rashi is connoting is the sense that Jethro is saying to Moses, you know, if God permits you to do this, and God not just permits im yitzaveh otcha, if the king in all his power, if he commands you la'asot kach, if you do what I'm suggesting to you, to do this, tuchal la'amod, you will be able to stand, you'll be able to survive. I think is what he's saying, right? You're not going to burn out. Ve'im ya'akev al yadcha, and the implication is, if he prevents you, lo tuchal lamod, this will not work. In other words, it's so interesting as I'm sort of meditating on what we're just reading now. You know, we know that there's theory, and I don't know if you've had the experience, but I know I have, where I've tried to think something out and thinking that a particular course of action makes sense, and yet when you actually apply it, there's things that come into play that make it impractical or a failure. So I wonder if that's in a sense what Jethro is conveying to Moses. In other words, he's not saying, I know what I'm talking about and you should do this, but he's saying, look, this is what makes sense to me. Because remember, he's been watching. Initially, he's watching Moses spend the entire day, with lines and lines of people coming for justice. And this is why he's telling him this. By the way, the other thought, of course, I have is that the fact that there are all these delays because Moses is trying to do this by himself and people are waiting and waiting and waiting. And I think there's a very true statement that says justice delayed is justice denied. So he's also speaking that way. But at any rate, I think there's a certain modesty in Jethro's words here. V'gam kol ha'amazeh, and also this entire nation. And what he's talking about, or people, I think Aharon, he's talking about Aaron, Nadav, v'Avihu, Aaron's two sons, Nadav and Avihu, v'shivim zekanim hanilvim ita, probably hanilvim ita imach, right? He's saying, and also the others. Remember, there were elders. We know from previous chapters in Exodus that it wasn't simply Moses. They did have these other people, but this still wouldn't have been enough, and they weren't the ones necessarily administering in the way that Moses was, and people were all coming to Moses. So he's saying Aaron, Avihu, and the 70 elders who are accompanying you. Okay? Ata here could mean now, right? Who are now accompanying you, who at present are accompanying you. And that Rashi's telling us that when it says Kol Ha'amazeh, it doesn't mean the entire nation of Israel, right? So definitely altering our initial understanding of what this verse might have meant. And of course, Rashi is representing the traditional understanding of these words to understand that it's referring, when it's saying this people, right, that it's referring to Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and the 70 elders. Onwards, there's a bunch of regular verses. So, new Vayishma Moshe lekol chodno. Beautiful statement. Here's this very, very important individual, Moses, right? Really uniquely important. And it says, Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law. So it's not always what you're saying. Sometimes very important. I think the reaction that most people tend to have is, and I'd include myself perhaps, is that, it's not always what that person is saying, but who's saying it to you. And that's being included here. So it's interesting that he paid such respect to Moses, had such respect for his father-in-law. Vayas kol asher amar, and he did everything, everything which he had said, which Jethro had said. Vayivcha Moshe, Moses chose Anshe Chayil, men of valor, Mikol Yisrael, from all of Israel. Vayiten otam, and he placed them, he set them, Rashim al ha'am, as heads over the people, Sarei alafim, captains of thousands, Vesarei me'ot, captains of 100. You can see that there's a process going here. That if they were captains of thousands, that meant that they were cases that could be judged relatively quickly. Sarei me'ot, captains of hundreds. So that would, I'm trying to think of how this would work out, whether actually here we're talking about just the opposite. V'sarei me'ot, I'd have to really think that through. Captains of hundreds, sarei chamishim, captains of fifties, v'sarei asarot, and captains of tens. So it would seem to me from this particular sentence that if you're a captain of 10, that means, well,
You get
that,
the low, that's
right,
the lowest amount. So you get, because you're going to
the
have way
most
more
number.
people.
Right. So there'd be
Right,
60 myriad of them. There'd be 60,000 of these people.
right.
Um, assuming that there were
And
600,000,
and if
at
it's
least we're counting them as 600,000.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you, if you're looking at it, it's kind of like how the Roman military setup. So
Mhm.
there's somebody who's over 10 people, and those 10
Right.
people go to him if there's a
Right.
problem. And then
Exactly.
if he can't handle it, goes to the next guy, goes to the next guy, all the way up.
Precisely.
I
Precisely. And that,
think
of
that's
course,
how it works. Otherwise, it'd be too crazy.
right. I agree. I think that's totally it. And the whole point about it is if this one person is responsible for basically a section of tens, like 10 families,
Hmm.
uh, then essentially
Manageable.
they can get hold of that person quickly,
And
right?
it's not a daily
The more
thing
they
then.
have,
No,
the
right.
yeah. So we're going from the most important individuals, right? The people who have the heaviest, weightiest cases to the people with the lightest cases.
Yeah. And then if the the guys at the top can't deal with it, then they shunt it off to Moshe. So
Yes.
yeah.
So that's a thank you. Yes. Let me make sure. Right. Okay.
Mm.
V'shaftu et ha'am b'chol eight, and this now has to be third person plural past, right? And they judged the people. Notice it's the same form of the verb, et ha'am b'chol eight, and that's why Rashi had to talk about it before because we've got exactly the same form of the verse, right? So of the verb, and they judged the people at all times. Et hadavar hakashe yaviu el Moshe, the more and the really tough cases they brought to Moses, v'chol hadavar hakaton, and all those of lesser complexity, I'd say, yishputu hem, they would judge. There's a Rashi on this. Okay. V'shaftu v'dinin yat ama, that the Aramaic, which would mean, and they judged the people, right? Yaviun meitin, they would bring, right? They'd bring. Yishputu heim. That's a yishputu is a sort of unusual form of the verb, and he says that it should be yishpatu with we'd say a shava. For some reason or another, the editor puts in the cholam. I do not understand why. There's no cholam there at all.
Well, actually, but
They're saying yishpotu.
my Chabad says yishpotu instead of yishpatu.
Yes. Okay. So that would be if it was in a pausal form, but I was looking at, and I think that's the way Chabad tries to harmonize what's going on here. But there should then be a vav right here, and there isn't. And yishpotu is a pausal form of yishpatu. So, and it's not in pause, by the way. Okay, that's mercha is not a pausal accent. So, but again, this is a little bit complicated. So, just have to just note that there's a question mark here. V'chein, he says, gives an example in Ruth chapter 2, lo ta'avuri. So there's also a strange and unusual form of the verb. Kamo lo ta'a. Well, again, in pausal form it would be lo ta'avori, but lo ta'avri. The Targumo, and he says, and the Targum uh, shows this. They say dinin inom, judge them. Mikraot Ha'elyonim. So he goes on to explain that the scriptural verses above that used a similar form of the verb, that even though the way the verb was punctuated was identical, right? He says those earlier verses, Hayu Lashon Sivui, they were actually they were commands. They were the imperative. Lachach Metugaman. So now he's actually explaining the Aramaic, that the fact that there's a difference in the way the Aramaic actually translates them, that there's that Onkelos, the author of the Aramaic translation, uses a different form of Aramaic. Meturgamin, he translates it Vayidonun, Yetun, Yidunun, and those are imperative imperative forms. I want to make sure we're talking about that. Okay. Um, let's make sure. Sorry. Okay, it's not. I'm trying to see here. Uh, Yeah, that's right. So that's an imperative form of the Aramaic, umikraot halalu. But these particular verses here, lashon asiyah, there they have the sense of performance, not of imperative, but of actually doing it, doing it. Let's see if we can go a little bit more. We almost finished at the shlishi portion. Vayishalach Moshe et chotno. Moses sent off his father-in-law. Vayelech lo el arzo, and literally Vayelech lo, and he himself went. Something literally it means he went for himself. And this law did not have to be in. Could have said Vayelech el arzo. So the question may well be as to what this little word is doing here. What's Scripture trying to tell us? What's the Torah trying to tell us? Right? But back to his country, his land. Vayelech lo el Atzor. So in other words, he went. Well, does the law here? I'm just simply trying to think this through. Does law mean for him with a capital H? He went for him, for God, in other words, to his land, because you're going to see what Rashi does here and why I'm trying to translate it that way. Legayer b'nei mishpato. Literally, it means to convert the members of his family. So if we can translate law as referring to God, then he went on God's behalf to his own land, Okay, let's see. Now, let's see if Rashi says anything. No, that's it. That's all there is there for the Rashi. So we should probably stop right here. Chapter 19 is the introduction to the giving of the Ten Commandments. So this is a good place for us to stop. And very good. I'll just set a marking here and add the bookmark. Let's see. Here we go. All right, I'm going to stop the share. And if any of you would like to comment at this point, any thoughts on what we just read?
What's the shoresh of that word?
What word are you talking about?
The yishpat,
Oh,
whatever.
shafat, shin
Yeah.
pei tet, which
Yeah.
means judge, right? To judge. He judged.
Okay.
Like
And how's
shep-
that different? Okay, so mishpacha is, and I was just looking at some of the
Right.
things
No.
that,
Right. No.
seeing if there was like, and it doesn't. No,
No.
like
There's no
shoftim.
connection. No connection.
like shoftim. Okay, well, again, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
was thinking from the very beginning of what you said, and we don't really have to get into this, and it could be implied in what you said. The very beginning of what you said was about Yitro converting, and that meant that he was accepting the monotheistic creator. But I was wondering to what extent conversion or being, so-called anachronistically Jewish to begin with, had to do anything with also halacha. I mean, like, so if you are accepting God, whether you're Aaron or Moses or Yitro, are you giving up like pork all of a sudden, which everybody else is eating, things like that?
Right. I think at this particular point, it maybe is, it's easier to speak in principle than necessarily in specifics. And the principle is that part of your statement that you accept God as your God is your willingness to accept God's judgments. And part of those judgments clearly are the legislation that come from a divine source. So you have to understand that when we practice mitzvot, we are underlining and actually corroborating our belief in God, that they go together. So
So
the answer, you go ahead.
even before the mitzvot were explicitly stated, we're supposed to believe the people followed them who accepted God because they had some understanding and relationship with God and kind of knew what he wanted even before it was all written
Yes,
out for everybody.
yes, I think so. I think, when we talk about our conscience, right, that we have a conscience, and that there's something within us that understands. Well, I think Hillel put it very, very well. It's put very well in the Talmud that the foundation of Torah is what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. And
Um,
when you contravene that, okay, when you contravene that, in a way, you're denying a monotheistic belief, because part of monotheism would then be to say that all creation, right, has one ultimate source. And as human beings, it doesn't. I like to point out, it doesn't say in the beginning God created the Jewish people.
mhm,
It doesn't say
mhm,
that. It says in the beginning God created human beings, and then what human beings did ultimately led to the selection of Abraham, etc., etc.
mhm.
But we all can either enter that covenant, that agreement, or not. We all can. Whether or not you start off, I mean, if you're born Jewish, depending, of course, on your family and your family's practices and things like that, it's the kind of invitation you've been given. But there's something, I think, very rational at the foundation of all of this in terms of what it means to believe in God, and to try and take that belief and not just say, "Oh yeah, I believe in God," and that's it. That's the end of the story. It isn't. It's just the beginning, right, of exploring what that exactly entails. But I think, whether it meant whether it meant Jethro gave up eating pork. Okay, good question. I'm not sure that that is kind of where we need to go on this, right? But it's also an explanation of what we mean by idolatry too, right? It is trying to have consistent that consistent relationship where what you do is a reflection both of that principle that Hillel said, and I think ultimately that statement in the Shema, which is not the line that we quote so much, but the line that says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." And of course, that is in the New Testament as one of the greatest commandments, except there it says with all your mind instead of all your might.
Hmm,
So yeah,
interesting.
so interesting. So there's a connection there.
Yeah. I have a question, but I don't need to answer it right now. We can talk about it another time.
Right.
Yitro,
Yes.
Jethro.
Yes.
He's the same Jethro from Genesis.
What Jethro did you see in Genesis?
Genesis 25:2. I have a note in my
Go
Tanakh
on quickly.
that he is the child of or grandchild or whatever or something of Abraham and Keturah. That
No, I okay.
so that
Of
was
Abraham and Keturah. Okay.
yes. At
Okay.
the end of so it's at the end of that.
Interesting. I'd have to go
So
back and look at the
yeah.
genealogy, Golda, because
Hmm.
it would have to do with the Midianites. Remember,
Yes,
is
that's
Midian
exactly
is
it.
Midian if
So he's
Midian?
like
Okay,
yes, he's a Midianite yeah,
okay,
Midian is one. That's what I've circled.
good point. Well, Golda, good for your
So
research.
he would
Excellent.
possibly have
Yes,
some idea of this anyway.
very good.
Not
That's great.
necessarily be circumcised, but
Right,
it depends on
right.
how many generations we have changed.
Yes,
But yeah.
When I'm looking that verse up, I don't see the name Yitro.
No, you don't. You see Midian.
right. That's all that matters. Remember, he is a Midianite, so we know
Yeah, he's
he's
Yeah.
descended. He may not be a
yeah, it's yeah.
grandson
I
or
had circled Midian, not
yeah. Right.
but
No,
Okay.
no, no.
yeah,
Very good point. Very good
yeah.
point. The issue is
Just
that he's descended from Midian.
All right.
Right.
We should
yeah.
do Kaddish to Rabbanan.
Okay.
Ooh,
I'm
please,
going to
yes.
stop the recording and we're going to go ahead and do that. And Golda, you're going to get to do it this morning. Okay.
Okay,
Thank you all.
let me find it.